Okay, so speaker today, Chris Purnell, has a background speaker today, Chris Purnell, has a background in field ecology and manages BirdLife Australia's wetland birds program, overseeing and implementing a portfolio of works focusing on conservation outcomes for the unique birds of Australia's diverse wetland types, from coastal sites to arid ephemeral wetlands. Chris's current project focus includes the effective use and delivery of environmental water, species recovery of Australian painted snipe and Australasian bittern, and shorebird conservation management in Indigenous protected areas and the Republic of Korea. So yeah, very diverse and interesting portfolio there, Chris. So yeah, welcome to the club, and look forward to what you've got to offer us tonight.
Thanks, Dan. And yeah, now I wish that I put that bio into a poem or a little haiku for Alan. But yeah, it's a bit dry after that. So and thanks for entertaining the entertainment, Greg. Hopefully be able to keep you guys awake throughout this presentation. So, so yeah, as you probably guessed, I'm going to present today on a little project which was a spin-off of a greater project, some of the work I was doing in Korea, called the Floating Roost Trial. And you might have heard a bit already from Emily Mowat, I think, perhaps last year. So I won't delve back into the background too much, but I will give you a bit of background and rationale just in case you've forgotten. And I won't go through all the partners there, except to say HBOC was integral in the Hunter. And so people like Alan and Anne and Tom Clark and Millie and Emily were very important to the program. So thank you to you guys. So I'll just kick off by just giving a little bit of background. I know I'm talking to shorebird experts here, but just in case, just one of the main sort of limiting factors to shorebird conservation now, and what we predict is going to be a huge limiting factor going forward, is coastal squeeze and the availability of high tide roosts. So obviously we know shorebirds spend their low time period feeding on the mudflats, but then get pushed up onto their roosting areas or into what we call supratidal habitats. So these areas which are beyond the tides, like clay pans or salt works. Increasingly, a lot of these areas are artificial sites, and a lot of conservation work is being focused now into these artificial areas. And Misha Jackson and Phil and others throughout the Flyway are focusing on documenting a lot of those artificial sites. So I'm going to use the word supratidal a lot today. So if you just consider that to be off the mudflat, so free of the tide is supratidal. But during those high tide periods, obviously birds are looking to roost, safe from predators, run routine maintenance, and be safe in general, maintain energy balance. So the project started off because we were doing some work in the Yellow Sea. I'm going to depress you for just 5 minutes here. So you've all heard this before, so hopefully it won't be too shocking and you'll stay on the line. Obviously, a key stopover site for a large proportion of Australia's 2 million shorebirds, which migrate through the East Asian Australasian Flyway, and heavy reliance, particularly on the Chinese, South Korean and North Korean coast in the Yellow Sea. Huge losses of up to 66% over the last 50 years in these habitats. Very well documented, the losses on these coastal areas, even in underdeveloped sites like North Korea. We still see high proportions of tidal mudflat loss. And this translates directly into the birds who are the most reliant on the Yellow Sea for stopover. So recent research done by Studs et al. And UQ looked to correlate the dependency of certain birds on the Yellow Sea and their declining trends. So as you can imagine, birds that rely more on the Yellow Sea, like Bartail godwits, Mensbrai, almost like entire population, the eastern curlew, great knot, red knot, they're by far the highest decliners, and over 95% of their entire population filters through this pinch point, the Yellow Sea. So the conservation of this area is integral to the conservation of the Flyway's whole population of these species. If we can't stitch it up, then they will not have the fuel to maintain themselves onto the breeding grounds and then breed successfully. So You've all heard about this one probably and brought tears to your eyes. So Simon Kuhn is the most famous reclamation within the East Asian Australasian Flyway. Famous, infamous, you choose it. Famous for developers, infamous for shorebird conservationists. A lot of that shorebird habitat is being lost through this process called reclamation, as you've all heard of before. Simon Kuhn was the largest seawall ever built in the world. Very ambitious project which basically blocked off the tidal influence of two huge estuaries, which were feeding the most important shorebird site in South Korea. And so 241 shorebirds, 41,000 shorebirds relied on this area, including 30% of the world's red knot. But so by 2006, it was walled across. And so you can see the differences there. The Simon Kuhn site is now basically a glorified lake. They were hoping to build on the mud flats, which were now tidally stranded and didn't get that daily flush, which made them useless for shorebirds. But they found that most of these sites are subsiding. They can't actually build on them. So it's a bit of a stuff up all around. I drove across that bridge. It took me, just for scale, took me half an hour to get from the top bit there, which you can see there's a big development there called Kunshan Port, just to that middle island. So it's an enormous project and blocks off an area of tidal flat and bay, which is about 8 times the size of Sydney Harbour. So not a small area. And what the Koreans said was, don't worry, those birds are going to go somewhere else. Don't worry about it. We'll be right. We've got enough mud flat. And if that was the case, we'd get the same amount of great knot coming down to Australia each year. I was up in Broome, were onto that, and they said, okay, we'll have a look and we'll keep monitoring our knots. And a quarter of the knots went missing from Broome and Roebuck Bay, and then follow-up surveys within the Korean sites, including the neighbouring sites, showed that those birds hadn't in fact gone anywhere. They were most likely dead. So up to 90,000 shorebirds just didn't turn up the following 2 years. And we're still in that state. So that's just a bit of a context. And it's not just Simon Kuhn. It's, if you've ever flown into Korea, you land on Incheon, which is which is a reclaimed island in a large tidal mudflat right near Seoul. And reclamation's ongoing, but they have since Simon Kuhn, because it's caused such national, so within Korea, the Koreans got upset about it, and international attention, that now they've made new laws and they're not doing any more large-scale reclamation. So one of the last ones that was cancelled was in a county called Socheon, just north of Simon Kuhn. Socheon actually refused to take industrial money and go down an economic pathway which would increase their local economy and local prospects, but just absolutely devastate the biodiversity. They were pretty brave and they said no to development, and large seawall was cancelled, and they chose to very progressively pursue this tourism and biodiversity pathway. So they're the guys that we chose to work with. So in 2015-16, I went over and worked with BirdLife International and Birds Korea, some of the local Koreans, state governments, and Socheon County, and tried to work out where we could fit in to assist their national efforts and their local efforts of shorebirds. You might be surprised, but the Koreans are very detached from nature, and it's probably because they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps after the Korean War and became from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the wealthiest, and that was through this Korean spirit of development and progress. And in that, a lot of people got really detached with nature, but now it's flipping over and people are coming back to nature and seeing the value of it. So they're welcoming outsiders in to help them with their conservation initiatives. So the Kuhn Estuary is now the most significant site in South Korea for shorebirds. So all the refugees that survived from Simon Kuhn are now actually over at the Kuhn Estuary and Junghang Coast. So that population has actually increased. So they've got a burden of more birds trying to use this small area. So they get around 172,000 birds filtering through there over a 40-day period in northern migration, and 39 species in significant numbers. It's one of the best places in the world to see spoonbill sandpiper and Norman's greenshank. Got 70% of the world's eastern pied oystercatcher subspecies. So it's a phenomenal site. You know, flocks of 500,000 Baikal teal come there as well. Phenomenal. And of course, internationally significant numbers of great knot and eastern curlew, two species that Australia and our government are really interested in trying to recover. So lots of interest there from our perspective. You know, if we're trying to conserve in Australia, it's one thing, but we've got to help conserve throughout the flyway. Every link in the chain counts. Ready? Just to make you smile. So we did a rapid assessment. You know, what can we do? We've only got a couple of weeks every year on the ground. So to go on a 2 to 3 week expedition there, try to speak to people, map out where the opportunities were. And one of the things we found within the area, even though it's underdeveloped, is that it's way more developed than an Australian coastline. And it's just because of the pressure of people. The pressure of the population of Korea is so densely compressed into the coast, because the centre of the continent, the peninsula, is so mountainous. So everything has been exploited all the way down to the coastline, and in fact, mostly onto the coastline and into the intertidal. So here's what we did. One of the things we did was look at the available roost sites. And so we mapped them out. You can see on the right there. So Simon Kuhn is in the bottom of the screen. And then you can see that big square jutting out the Gunsan port. And to the north of that river, the Kuhn Estuary, is Sochon County. So that's who we're working with, and those mudflats. And Yubido or Yubu Island, you might have heard of, is a really significant site. Got World Heritage listing recently for its overall value. It's got historic fishing village living there. Average age on the island is about 85. And a lot of the younger people within the whole county emigrate out. So what we did, we looked at the available roost sites on all the tidal conditions, and we noticed that these birds were on some of the high tides were taking to the sky and just flying around in circles. So what we found was that 6 of the 7 roost sites in that system were not actually available to the birds on 54% of the high tide. So each day on half of the days, come high tide, there was nowhere for that large population of shorebirds to roost. So either they would go and roost in one of the artificial dredge spoiler islands in the estuary, go south to some of the burrow pits in Simon Kuhn, or fly 25 kilometres to the next site. The rest of them just circle around in the air. It's absolutely phenomenal. This is why although it's very, very densely populated, the red is all these industrial areas. There's also a lot of rice fields and dammed creeks and rivers. So this is actually in this is in the more progressive area. This is in Sochon, so the area which is less developed. The coasts are developed because they thought, oh, we want to promote people going to see nature, so we'll build boardwalks all the way down to the water. So they actually built on the shorebird habitat, thinking that people would then go and see the shorebirds. So this is a shorebird tourist path, for example, in Sochon County. Here you go. Here's your low tide feeding area, beautiful mud flat. Thousands of birds out there at low tide. High tide, it hits a wall. There's nothing. So birds have to up and go and find somewhere. Where are they going? It's the same all the way up. So there's coast roads, you know. We did surveys all up and down the coast. This is another tourist walk here at low tide. The tide comes right up to the top there at high tide. So where the birds go, they go and roost on the actual seawalls. They roost in nearby aquaculture ponds. I can see those curlews on the right, and they're all jostling for position. These are in a mud bank, a little shrimp pond. And down the bottom, you can see they're actually roosting on a dredge spoil right in the middle of the shipping channel. So that was pretty ironic. And they're just getting buffeted by wind. There's boats going past all the time. Not ideal. So it's no wonder that a lot of them end up. Now, I don't know if this video is playing properly, but probably 10,000 birds circling over your head at any one time on high tide. So this is as we were. This is what we call an aerial roost. So this is as we were putting the bags out on a high tide one day. You guys seeing that? Give me the thumbs up if you can actually see a jolted picture of birds.
How long would they fly around for?
Sometimes they fly around for the extent of that. If it's a spring tide, sometimes up to an hour. And so during that period, they're swooping down, looking for extra opportunities. Some are landing in already condensed roosts and forcing other birds off. Some species are more aggressive than others and more successful in doing that. So it's a really dire situation. So we thought we've got to find a solution to this, and we were initially thinking of artificial roost construction, which has been very successful all around the world, and we had experts from RSPB come across and give talks about terraforming and BirdLife International and others from around the world. But it can be expensive, and unfortunately and ironically, Korea had just signed this Public Water Reclamation Act, which meant that you couldn't build on the tidal flat. It was to save the birds, but you couldn't build shorebird habitat on the flat because of this rule that you couldn't do anything below the. It's all very bureaucratic over there. So you can imagine my confusion not speaking Korean and having all this bureaucratic papers to wade through. So that was sort of off the cards, and we really needed a quick, simple, low impact solution. And so it was when I got a photo from a colleague of an eastern curlew sitting on one of these oyster bags from Merimbula Lakes. Some of you guys might know him, Dan Weller. He's got a house up there. And he goes out and bothers birds all day long, photographing them. And he said, "Oh, this is the best spot. You can get right up close to them." And then one night I was working on roosting options, and the light clicked, and I said, "Oh, why don't we just use the oyster bag?" So I packed a bag and chucked some nice dry white in there, sampled some oysters, and met up with the oyster bag guys, and they were really chuffed to be involved. So this is an innovative oyster farming technique which was developed in the Merimbula Lakes and now has been exported all over the world. These small group of guys doing fantastic stuff, lower impact on the intertidal area or the subtidal area that they're in, very cheap and easy to install, and produce terrific yield for the oysters. So we thought we'll give it a bang. So what we did, we filled the bags with oysters because we wanted, if you can see here, you're all familiar with oysters. I'm guessing that you're all we're all pretty bougie in this circle here. So there's a very complex surface for invertebrates to colonise. So they provide weight to the bag, but they also provide a surface for potential shorebird food to grow on. So we've got these bags, and you can see one here. Oh, my screen's not allowing that, but you can see oyster bag is it's made of mesh. It allows water to come through, and inside the bag holds the oysters. So we started with a very small trial. Just you can see the diagram below, 120 bags per roost, 25 metre long, three lines per roost, and we wanted to try them in a few different places, in a few different regions. but before the Koreans could give us the okay, we wanted to prove it here, because I couldn't just rock up on the government store and say, hey, I'm this bloke from Australia, just trust me, mate, I got this under control, watch me do this. So I had to prove it in Australia first. And we actually had a trial lined up in one of my study sites in South Australia, which I've been working in for probably 13 years now, in the Dry Creek salt fields. But the new salt field owners kicked me out right at the 11th hour. So I had to scramble, and funnily enough, the local LLS in Hunter were having chats with BirdLife at the time about conservation action planning, and they said, well, why don't you try it up here? We've got concerns about our shorebird population, and we're trying lots of different things, open to it, come along. So we started off in the Western Treatment Plant and the West Port Phillip Bay in Melbourne. A lot of you guys know that, I'm sure. Then we installed in Newcastle and Sotchon County. So the Port Phillip Bay trial, tried some in sewage ponds, some out on the coast, and some in a little sheltered bay known as Spit Conservation Reserve. So 3 different sort of, just to get an idea of the different types of and durability of the infrastructure within different scenarios and how birds would use them. And within this area, Melbourne Water, they manage their property fantastically for shorebirds. So there are heaps of options out, and it's certainly not a limiting factor there. So we knew that it wasn't going to be absolutely swamped with birds because they've got so many options. We put it in anyway, just as a proof of concept. Hunter, as you know, we had a lot of help from Gavin and his team over at Kooragang Parks and Emily and local oyster farmers. The oyster catchers didn't help, no. But we put them in at Barry's Beach up on Thornton Cove, that little tiny beach there, which is flanked by mangroves. Kooragang Dykes, that northern area right next to where the roost is on the rocks. Our theory was that if birds are thermoregulating, trying to stay cool as they do, resting on damp sand and or even in the water, perhaps those rocks are too hot. Would they prefer roosting on the bags? And Stockton Sandspit. So I was very ticky-touchwood about this because I didn't know the area at all, never been there. And so I was very uncomfortable with it all. So when we were scoping the sites, I wanted to put them as far away from the current roosting sites and try not to overlap too much with the feeding areas. So I pushed them a little bit further from where I would traditionally put them in my own sites that I know well, just to give the birds a bit of room. So we pushed that one, that Stockton Sandspit one, right up probably 70 or 80 metres from where the actual roost is, up into the intertidal. Now, to monitor them. So initially I thought, we'll get people out monitoring them, and the amount of people at WTP, at Western Treatment Plant, I'll be bombarded with sightings. And I put out these signs at each one of the roosts, and I think I got one back. But when I followed up with remote cameras at all the roosts, I was able to see the people who weren't submitting data. So I've got a name and shame list. I've got a black book with all their names in it. They'd go right up to the roost. They'd be looking at the birds, and then I'd be anticipating them sending in their data. Never did. So I had to rely on remote cameras. So at WTP and in Korea, I put cameras out. We didn't put them at Stockton because I was worried about them getting pinched, and you guys have got a lot more fishermen and using the area. Not saying anything bad about the grand people of Newcastle, but they're also expensive. So I was able to access some really whiz-bang tech RO cameras, which I can access on my phone, much to the dismay of my wife. I'd be wake up in the middle of the night looking at ducks in a lightning storm. I took this photo actually at church on Christmas Day. One day I go to church a year with my mum, and I was like, oh, check this out. Look at all these birds on the roosts. So it was a bit cheeky, but it was really good. And they had mixed fates. We had some birds roosting on the thing. We had birds shitting on them. We had storms knocking them over. but we got good results from in the long run. So we was able to, in the long term, we were able to prove our proof of concept. We had shorebirds, waterbirds, terns and gulls, including fairy terns and whatnot, using the roost. So I was able to take that to the Herons and pitch it to them after a lot of licensing and payment discussions. And we met with the fishing community and the different government departments. I wore a tie. It was all very, very fancy, and we got over the line and were able to install in April 2019. So here we have on the right Solree, which is a very highly densely populated roost approaching high tide. But as you can see, even that small tidal creek is dammed over. So there's a wall which runs there, precludes any tidal access to the creek, and you can imagine, and there's also just to the north a little aquaculture farm. There's been building right up onto all the high tide areas. So the bottom left is a photo of birds accumulating at the approaching high tide, but most of those birds have to leave, and that's the last spot that a lot of birds accumulate. The one below Jungu Bay is where we put another roost, and that was the second last spot that a lot of the birds are able to accumulate, and including high numbers of around a couple of thousand Eastern curlew and Eurasian curlews. So it was what we call a transition roost. So we put them in there, just the three of us, me, Young Min Moon, and that's Bob Nichols, who's a Kangaroo Island oyster farmer. He had a great time over there, but that's it. We're just three of us put this all together on April 20, 2019. Seconds after scrambling up the sea wall, I said those birds were, you can see in that top right photo, they're accumulating along the high tide line. Once they pushed up all the way to us, we're able to float the bags and drag them out, tie them off on the screw anchors and leave, scaled the sea wall, and these birds came and landed on it straight away. So a couple of pteric sandpipers, a couple of days later, we had around 20 birds using the roost on the, then a couple of weeks later, we had about 300 birds on the same roost. So they were obviously very desperate and obviously very adaptable. So it didn't take long, and then we had around 400 birds, including spoonbills, Eastern curlews using them, Chinese egrets, and all sorts, competing for space on roosts. Then on southern migration, I didn't expect this. This was early southern migration, August, in the west coast of Korea, and we had around 500 to 600 small shorebirds jostling for position, and this was captured by the local government CCTV, which they normally have pointing the other way to catch criminals, but they kindly spun it around and were focusing on my roost for me. So this image, I just put the image there because the video doesn't play very well, but birds coming and going, getting pushed off and on. You can, it's really desperate stuff. I mean, it's validating the concept of the roost, but at the same time, it's very depressing to think that they need to use an artificial floating oyster farm, which wasn't there a couple of months earlier, and it's such a prized bit of real estate. So pretty depressing stuff. So we think that around 500 to 600 small shorebirds is probably the capacity for these things. Overall, the results were pretty compelling from Korea, which is a highly impacted coastline. So from Korea and Australia together, we had 58 species of waterbirds, including 21 species of shorebirds, using it around 500 as the max. The most important factors are the site selection and the species which use them. And I'll come back to that later. So we had, as you can just see, a proportion of the 58 species there below, mostly shorebirds, but we did have waterfowl, terns, egrets and herons, and you can see on the edge, black-faced spoonbill, internationally IUCN red listed, a bird, cormorants, a wide variety. And of course, I don't want to miss out in the hunter, kingfisher, single kingfisher. So very important. And then I've done some digging around and found other oyster farms that are actually using this new technology in Maine on the east coast of America. Lots of different species over there using the oyster farms to roost as well. So it's quite interesting. Obviously, the most heavily used sites were in Korea, and they peaked every single day. You can see on that chart on the left, every day on northern migration, the roosts were used. So 100% of recordings had birds, not 100% days had birds on them, because we recorded at high and low tide, so not every recording had a bird on. Also, 100% of southern migration, October, had birds recorded in it. And we found that we did a multivariate analysis of what were the factors which most influenced it. And it seemed to be obviously wind speed, which can be anticipated. And you can imagine they wouldn't want to be out there on a very windy day. So above around 25 kilometres an hour wind, they didn't want to use it. Weather, so inclement weather, they didn't want to use the roost. They're a bit too exposed. And the tide. So it wasn't, but what we found was it wasn't actually the tide height at the time. So it was the tide height, the max tide height during the day. So what we had was on days where there was anticipated to be a spring tide, birds would start accumulating on the roost hours before the tide had even reached the roost. So we'd have birds sitting on mud hours before the water had even reached the roost. So it was interesting that they were able to anticipate these max daily high tides and find a safe roosting spot early. So the results also showed that the region was really important. So obviously they were most used in the areas which were most highly impacted, but also within the region, they were most used in areas which were closest to last site to be inundated. So the last, what we call I call the roosting site. So the very last site that they can sit in, or where we knew they were roosting. So our mapping found that Solree, this site, was the last site that they could safely roost before getting pushed off. We put them there, and they were more successful there than the transition sites where they get incrementally pushed off them as the tide comes. And we found that there were things which influenced it, which I would never have predicted. Up on the top there, you can see this is a little river on Port Phillip Bay, which is it's exposed coastline. We get wave action through there, and there's birds on it there. You see the next image. There was a huge storm, algal growth, and there's a natural floating roost out in the bay. So this actually just completely negated any of my attempts. I was out there hours putting these bloody screw anchors in, and then this big island of weed just comes and all the birds go flock onto it. So, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. So that was just a few interesting things which happened. And the hunter. Now, why didn't birds use the hunter? So we had, I can count on one hand very quickly the amount of shorebirds which we recorded. And so that was Tom Clark and Anne, I think, might have seen them as well, a couple of grey-tailed tattlers which used the Stockton sandspit. And I can't explain it, but I can probably hypothesise. So the hunter remained unused by shorebirds, perhaps because you've got such a mosaic of alternatives, and there might even be further sites which we haven't considered, which I think that you guys are already investigating, Alan, through drone work over in the stranded salt marsh and the areas to the north, which potentially could hold lots of birds. So if birds are disturbed off Kooragang, they can go to Stockton, or they can go to Fullerton Cove, or they can go. Tom actually recommended putting a floating roost in an area which was at the mouth of Fullerton Cove there, in the little sort of tidal creek in the Channel Islands there. So it could be that they just have enough sufficient sites to prop them up in areas when one or many sites aren't available. But Anne pointed out very aptly that some of the birds roost in what I would consider, and she considers, absolutely shocking conditions. So that Fern Bay site right next to the road, you get those tattlers and terrics jammed up against the rocks right up next to the long grass. they seem to like it, or they like it better than our roosts at least. So I won't take it personally, but there you go. So that could be a reason. And I think probably is the reason that you guys are doing a good job at conserving sites within the hunter to sufficiently look after the population. There could be the fact that monitoring methods didn't allow for greater coverage, so we didn't get a greater picture of what was happening. So we didn't, whereas we had the luxury of 24-hour surveillance at the other sites. I know that some of the photos we got back of the roosts had bird poo on all over the roosts early, but we don't know what left it there. So it could have been the one grey heron that just ate a bad curry. Sorry, one great white-faced heron. I'm speaking in my Korean bird language here, grey heron. And yeah, so there are lots of different things. One of the interesting things that we saw in Western Treatment Plant was that for the last month of summer, when they allowed the ponds to dry out, one of their conservation ponds that they manage for shorebirds, they allowed that to dry out right near the Spit Conservation Reserve. The habitat was lost locally, birds flew over, and that's when we had the highest counts on the Australian and highest diversity of shorebirds on the Australian floating roost. So we had nearly 100 birds using the Spit Conservation Reserve quite regularly, green shanks and lapwings and oystercatchers and curlew sandpipers, sharp-tailed sandpipers, a big array, quite an array of shorebirds using them regularly because locally there wasn't available habitat. So how am I going for time there, Dan? I haven't been keeping an eye on it. All right, cool.
Hey, Chris, just a quick question. Like, what about the substrate? Could that play a part? Like those tattlers and terex are just like pretty used to being on the rocks, and other birds as well. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think that some birds are definitely more adaptable and cosmopolitan than others in their roost choice. And so we, while not catering for any particular bird, we did see that there were preferences within species. And yeah, tattlers, terex, sandplovers seem to, and turnstones, all very regularly roost on rocks. And they were very happy to take to the roosts. And we, theorise that as long as we're providing extra capacity, so we're taking capacity constraints off a natural roost and birds are roosting here, we're providing more capacity. It doesn't really matter what species it is. If it's for threatened species, or that's good. But at the same time, if we take 1,000 terex and tattlers and a few hundred curlews off one roost, and it makes more room for 200 great knot at the natural roost, then that's a win as well. So our idea of success was pretty. It sort of evolved over the time. And speaking of substrate, this was part of this study here. So we hypothesised that the wetness and the ability for the water to come through the mesh and birds to keep their feet wet, but also use the evaporative cooling effect of water to stay cool would be attractive to birds. So we put thermologgers on the floating roosts and on natural roosts to measure the differences between what the roosts' temperatures were and what the birds were experiencing, because they want to maintain the most flatline or stable temperature possible, so they're not expending energy on either staying warm or getting too cool. And what we found was that, yes, the water did have both insulative and cooling properties. So you can see down in that box plot there, the floating roosts are the two on the left and the natural roost is on the right. And we had over 3 times more temperatures over 30 degrees on the natural roosts than we did on floating roosts. And we had a significantly wider temperature range, both cooler and warmer at natural roosts, because they were not getting the benefit of the cooling properties of water. So that was an interesting outcome, which we will look to optimise when we're designing this phase 2 of the roost. We also found that in some of those very, as you can imagine, very flat landscapes that birds sometimes roost, they often look to reduce wind drag and wind effects, so that on even low tides, they were roosting on or around the roost, using in the leeward side of the roost, floating roosts, to avoid the effects of wind. Now, there are some other weird results. So we had birds feeding on the roost as we anticipated. We hoped they would, feeding on the oysters. There he is. Hang on. So that I did some very coarse sampling and got a mate from Melbourne Museum to do some sampling for me. But I did most of it I'm actually in my garage here, which is also my mobile lab. And we did some coarse sampling and found, the roosts were colonised almost immediately, and the species turnover and biomass was enormous. We had some roosts got a more diverse range and more abundance than others, as you can actually imagine, to the point where some were burdened with the weight of colonisation. But we also had birds like avocet. So we had birds feeding on the roosts throughout the tide cycle. And we also had birds like filter feeders like avocet and stilt and spoonbills, as you can see in the top left there, feeding between the lines in the water column, because debris falling off and potentially invertebrates within the water column getting stuck in the roost. They were sort of going up and down them like they were shopping alleys. We also had one species, pied stilt, attempt to nest on the roost. So we had 6 pairs of pied stilt nesting on the roost last year. Early this year. What year are we in? I don't know. I can't remember. Is it 2022 yet? And then I don't actually know what the fate of those nests was. So a couple of them got blown over. I found egg fragments in them. I wasn't able to get back out because of COVID to actually monitor the fate of the nests. There were some, by the time I got back, there were some fledglings walking around, precocial birds, obviously. So hard to tie it directly to those, but at least there was an attempt made to nest on the roosts. We also had, obviously, the off-target species, the threatened species I spoke about. We had vegetation growing on them. So we had samphire growing in some of the more sedentary ones. And we had fish. So every time I'd go into a couple of them, the more sheltered sites where obviously you'd expect fish nurseries to be, I had fish fry running away swimming away from me and taking shelter within the bags. And this is something that I spoke to the oyster farmers about, and they said, yeah, it's a pain in the ass, because all the fish fry, they go in there and they feed on the invertebrates which are growing on the oyster shells, and some of them get so fat that they pull out huge adult fish which are too big to get out through the mesh. So it provides a little shelter for fish and a little nursery for fish. It has its downsides, as I mentioned. Some of the sites got so weighed down with certain species of colonially gathering polychaetes in particular, which clump together enormous amounts of sediment, and then anemones colonise the sediment and further adhere by accumulate extra sediment. Some of the bags, which originally we aimed to have them 4 kilograms at the maximum, ended up weighing nearly 3 times that. So you can see that they were sinking with the accumulated fouling. And the oyster farm guys, they actually design them that you can flip them over so they don't get fouled. But I wanted to promote them and probably got a bit too greedy and promoted too much growth, and they started sinking. So that was a bit of a problem. As you can see down the bottom, barnacles started growing on the floats, which then creates an issue for abrasions. And in the Hunter, we had a little floating nursery there. You can see those bloody mangroves, they get everywhere. And there were mangroves growing out of the oyster bags. So a few issues there. The other things that so roost maintenance will be something that we have to look into. And some sites don't need any maintenance. Some sites need some maintenance. They're very strong infrastructure. They grow these oysters out on the high intensity coasts of Canada using these techniques. They've got a couple of ton weight strength on the shark, what we call shark lines. They survived the monsoons in Korea for 3 years running. So we're confident in some things, but then you can never predict these sort of things like the sinking bags. So the next step that we're going to take is looking at alternative materials. So I've been working with a post-grad student in RMIT University in the School of Design there, who's looking at alternative materials. I'm obviously very wary that these things are made out of plastic. It's very high density UV resistant plastic, but anything that you put in the ocean is going to have a chance to have microabrasions and contribute to microplastics. So we want to try to get plastic out of the equation and potentially provide for local communities in making, utilising local handcrafts and ancestral ways in creating these things. So she's investigating some really innovative stuff. So using traditional handcrafts, either because a lot of these coastal communities have lived and fished in the area for decades, if not hundreds of years or even thousands. So they have utilised things like pandanus, bamboo, gourds, rushes, and making materials and weaving them, bags and whatnot. But then also accepting the new age and embracing some new materials like pumice stone and mycelium, which is actually a fungus, which can grow into a mould, which as in a mould shape, not a mould growth, which will then be floatable and give us a honeycomb lattice, which hopefully then will be colonised the same way that a oyster shell is. So really innovative and exciting stuff. Prototypes were meant to be deployed for testing earlier this year, but we haven't been able to get it on site. The other opportunities, to build into local economies. So these places where there are immigration, particularly within Korea, everyone going to Seoul, a lot of old knowledge isn't getting passed on to the younger generations. The economy is struggling. We want to create options not only for them to perhaps harvest and build the roosts, which will then contribute to local avitourism and conservation, but potentially also farm oysters. So they use very intensive and labour intensive and intensive on the environment techniques for farming oysters in the LAC at the moment, like driving giant concrete poles into the intertidal and just allowing oysters to encrust them and having a guy go out, probably paid a couple of bucks an hour to scrape them off. And this is happening throughout the LAC coast. So if we can introduce this new technique, it'll be a win for the local economy, win for local fisheries and heritage, and potentially shorebirds, hopefully. So what's phase 2 look like? So we hope to scale up, make these roosts a little bit bigger within the LAC. I've been speaking to the Ministry of Fisheries in Korea and putting together a proposal for them so that they can work autonomously. So I would like to see them take this and run with it themselves and have it as their own project, because at the end of the day, I'm here in Heidelberg Heights. I can't be over in Korea and want the Koreans to be the masters of their own destiny. Altering the layout to be perhaps more efficient, so we can bunch the bags a bit closer to allow better thermoregulation for the birds. Encourage parallel efforts, so you can see there's an attempt by Port of Brisbane. They went off and did their own trial. Wasn't very successful because they didn't allow the water to come through. They just piled shell into the floating embayments there. But yeah, there's another trial starting in Bundaberg Port and Moreton Bay have investigated all of their options and considering floating roosts as well. But what we're doing now is developing a toolkit for land managers. I don't want this to be used as a crutch or an offset or anything. This is the last thing I want. So I want that this is a last ditch emergency temporary intervention. So I actually don't want it to be used in Australia. I think that Australia, we've got enough luxury and we've got the management mechanisms and we've got enough coastline that we can manage shorebirds by returning habitat to its natural state. But in areas in Korea, that's just not going to be possible. So I think it is required perhaps in the LAC. We've had interest from New Zealand, Scotland, all these areas around the US. I think that those countries where they still have intact coastal environments and regions where they're intact, they have options for management. Conservation management should look to restore. If in the short term they need to put in a floating roost, so be it. But the fewer floating roosts out there, the better, in my opinion, which is a strange thing for me to say, but I think that's the way to go. In the meantime, we'll diversify the trial types. We'll try these new materials so we can get to a final product quicker. And we'll start to assess the LOC habitats, so particularly on the Chinese coastline, which has gone through pervasive change and is under increasing pressure from disturbance, that we can look to potentially approach those stakeholders now that we've got the UNESCO World Heritage listing for mudflats within the LOC chain site. We should be promoting more unified conservation approaches in those areas. There you go. I just wanted to round that home with some red text. Don't get alarmed. Last resort intervention for emergency cases only. So it's been proven to work in high density areas and can be useful, but ultimately the manager of that coastline and those biodiversity assets should be seeking to restore natural sites and restore natural hydrology to maintain shorebird habitats, not installing artificial roosts like this. That's it. Thanks. And thanks to all the smiling, happy, muddy people who helped along the way. Thank you. I'll stop sharing, Dan.
Right. Excellent. Oh, it's just my silence. I was reaching for the mute button so I could actually talk. No, really, really interesting talk there, Chris. And I like your delivery style as well. So certainly kept me awake, and I hope would have kept everyone else awake. It was really good. So thanks very much. I'm sure there'll probably be a few questions because we'll probably have a few shorebird enthusiasts in the audience. So what we may do is people can just unmute themselves and ask a question, or do that stick your hand in the air function if you like, and I'll keep an eye out for that. Or we've got the chat option as well. We've got Matea sticking her hand up there. Off you go, first cab off the rank.
Thanks, Chris, for that talk. It was really fascinating to hear what's being done. I was just wanting to, maybe I missed it at the start, but with using the oyster bags, does that have a dual thing in being used for farming, or is it simply just building on that concept and then they're solely for the roost?
Yeah, so our initial trial is just using the ready-made commercially available bags. So we just wanted to see if proof of concept, do they work before we can adapt them into our new methods. But having said that, we would potentially, to add a little carrot for coastal and communities, like to have the option for them to farm as well, so that they're using coastlines in a sustainable way and that they're improving their methods of farming. Which would benefit waterbirds as well.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
So, Chris, these things are anchored down, so you've got to be in reasonably shallow water. Is that right?
No, you can have them in as deep water as you want. So, so if you, as long as you've got it, so it gets tethered from a screw anchor or a bonnie. So you can, if as long as you've got an anchor, you can either. So a lot of the Marimbula Lake stuff, for example, is subtidal, and they just use a long arm on an auger to screw in the. So they have a diver go down, place the, and I'll get the. I'll get my background out so you can have a look at. Welcome to my garage. So that's a screw anchor, and as long as the auger can fit onto the top there and spin it around, and that might be a long arm or a diver going in there and driving it into the sediment. You can have them in deep water as well.
All right.
As long as, and then you have a tethering rope and then the line which runs from end to end.
I just got the impression the one at Fulton Cove was a bit close up to the mangroves. It could have been further out, but I just assumed that was a constraint, was actually being able to walk out to where to put it. That's all.
Yeah, no, the Fulton Cove one was probably not ideally placed. I wanted it to be close to the shore so that birds would use it, and I wanted to be far enough from the mangroves, but I think I ended up putting it too close to the mangroves. I didn't want to put it onto the feeding area or onto the current roost, but I want it to be within eyesight, within line of sight, and within the movement of the birds when they're coming, when the tide's being pushed in, for them to be able to use it. But
just knowing how some of our birds use the estuary, they'll use these sort of spits right out the middle of the river, right to the top of the tide until they have to fly. So I'm just picturing these things a bit further out. Probably would have been used. That's all.
I probably could have been. I will. The site selection things still. I think I need to do each site need to do a really big stakeholder engagement process and nut these ideas out. And unfortunately, the hunter process was a little bit curtailed, as you guys know, because we had to jump off the South Australian one onto the New South Wales one. But yeah, it's worth investigating, going deeper. I haven't got any. I have got a couple of subtitle ones. Yeah.
Cool.
So, Chris, if it's not too big a question, in the Kuhn Estuary, you said that there were six of the sites they couldn't use at high tide because they were covered over. What ended up happening there, or has it all been constrained by COVID?
Well, so there's still. I mean, nothing's changed with the existing natural roosts. They're still under pressure, and we've still got the roosts in. We've still got the floating roosts in sight. But I mean, if you consider the total population at any one time's, about 90,000 birds, and our roosts can sustain maybe 500 each roost, and we've got three roosts.
How many roosts have you got in there? Sorry,
only 3. So it's piecemeal, really, in the large population scale. So ultimately, as I said, it's doing a job as taking pressure off a handful of birds or pressure off a handful of roosts. But ultimately, we'd want to upscale, make them bigger, while the Koreans are progressing options to provide more supratidal habitats. And so what we're discussing in that system there is repurposing coastally adjacent rice paddies. So buying rice paddies off local farmers, and then either reinstating tidal influence or wetting them with seasonally to make it seasonally available for birds, shorebirds. So there are a couple of the options, and we've got the BTO involved in that. So hopefully that'll be progressed.
Thank you.
Chris, did you have any wild weather at any of the sites, like hurricanes in Korea? And if so, how do the roosts survive wild weather?
Yeah, we had the monsoon every year in that site there, and you can tell by the buildings whenever you go somewhere, nothing's over a couple of stories high, that it's going to be a pretty treacherous area. And yeah, I was surprised our cameras and the roosts both survived, and we got this classic footage of these grey herons. They're all facing one direction. They must be facing either into or away from the wind, and these are just getting buffeted, and the roosts are going like this, and the birds are just going running. So it looks like they're on a roller coaster. It's pretty classic. Same with the Port Phillip Bay site. So that occasionally does get, especially in the last couple of years. Maybe I'm just more switched onto it now. I wake up in the middle of the night and hear a gust of 100 kilometres out the window, and I think the roosts. And then I go and review the footage, and there's sort of ducks taking refuge. There'll be driving rain, and a duck will come in and just bomb in and take refuge on the roost. But yeah, they've been surprisingly resilient, except that a couple of so these are the clasps which hang on to the line, and a couple of them have snapped on the site where they've been weighed down. So where this becomes too heavy, we've had, but thankfully there's two, so we didn't lose any bags.
Okay. Any more questions? Just give a little while for any more opportunities, and then we'll move on. Can't spot any. Oh, there's the chat from Mick.
Oh, it's great stuff, I reckon. Really, really great stuff.
Yeah, no, it's
Thanks,
there aren't
Mick.
many good stories for migratory shorebirds, are there? So it's good to actually have some, a positive in that space.
Well, it's worth a try. That's the thing.
Yeah, and particularly if it's if it's obviously still dependent on broader habitat restoration, at least it might bridge that gap, that time that's taken to do larger, more other works to help conserve them. And clearly you can see that if you've got a situation where birds are flying around in a big flock for an hour, then that's got to really take its toll on them. So they need immediate relief from that, and that this is obviously going to help provide that relief. Again,
Dan Allen's asked a question there.
Oh, he has. Oh, okay. I see. There's another.
Back to Dan. Yeah, not that we can tell on a population level, Dan. Too early to tell, and then the trial's too small. I don't think it would really.
Yeah, so that's something you'd get off there once the upscaling's happened. Then, Chris, that'd be obviously something you'd be keen to monitor.
Yeah.
I mean, no, say it wouldn't have had a positive effect on numbers, but I reckon it's certainly going to have had a positive effect on those birds that were having to fly around. Just the energy expenditure.
The individuals would have had it. Yeah.
So clearly,
and even if it's only used for, one tide in a week, that's still saves them flying for an hour. So if it's vacant for the rest of the time, that's fine.
Yeah, no, it'd be interesting with upscaling to see if it does have a discernible impact on the numbers, particularly if we can monitor that benefit here. That'd be really positive outcome. So
just
something to look forward to.
Just a question. to do with the site where the birds are flying around for like an hour and that. Do you know how long that's potentially like happened for? Like when that would have been from losing other sites earlier? Like how long?
Yeah, so it probably would have, I mean, there's a couple of things there. It's like, it's always a death by 1,000 cuts with these things, but the Simon Kuhn wall closure in 2006 would have increased the burden of that population moving to this new area, so that there would have been a carry capacity restraint, and so that would have put more birds in the air. And then there's been little incremental changes, as you saw on those coastal developments, just the little walkways being built, roads being built, little tidal creeks being cut off. All, it might affect 100 birds here, 200 birds there, but along a 60-kilometre stretch of coast, it all adds up, and it might end up affecting, 5,000-10,000 birds. So it's probably most likely the majority happens in the last 15 years.
There's another question in the chat now, Chris. Says, how long do the birds stay in South China Sea before flying north to breed?
They can stage, well, some of them actually don't leave, but they can stage there for anywhere from sort of 2 to 3 weeks. Some of them might just drop in for a couple of days, but it's a bit of a sliding scale of the phenology of those birds. Different species arrive at different times, and different species stay for different periods. Some stay for months. So it's a bit of a tricky question. I've got to, if you actually go to the project website, so there's the Floating Roost website, there's also GUM, so GEUM.birdlife.org.au. Down the bottom is a report on the Kuhn Estuary that I prepared, and I've tried to go species by species. So we consolidated all the data from the different NGOs and government bodies, and it goes through species by species and shows the peak times that they migrate through Kuhn Estuary and how they use it, and the numbers. So that might give you an insight. I can't, off the top of my head, it's hard to reel off the different species, but have a look. It's quite fascinating to see how they stage through. So like at the start, I said 172,000 birds go through, but not at the same time. So you'll have waves of different species coming through at different times.
Okay. All right. We'll leave that there then. So again, on behalf of the club, thanks very much, Chris. Really fascinating talk.
Thank you for your help, guys.
Very engaging. So yeah, thank you. And